Drobo Broadcast Network. My name is Mario Blandini at Drobo, and today we have a special guest, Rick Vanover, who is a product strategy specialist with Veeam and has virtually, and actually every single certification that exists under the sun. How you doing today, Rick?
Well, not quite every certification, but yes, quite a bit. Thank you for the warm introduction, Mario. It's great to be here.
All right, today's topic, even smaller shops can get the benefits of virtualization with instant recovery. And recovery really is the reason why you do backups. And we're discussing approaches and architectures for backup of virtual machines in smaller IT environments. And Veeam, as a technology provider, has solutions in this area, as does Drobo. But today's discussion is about general architectures to give you an idea on the best ways to approach those from a small and medium business perspective. As we go here to the next slide, backing up physical machines, let's face it, it's a challenge by itself. No one was really happy with the way they do backups. But if you add virtual machines to that, there's several factors that we'll discuss in today's broadcast that are unique to virtualization and require you to potentially take a different look at the way you're going to do your data protection for virtual machines. So we're talking about that, and as always, you want to provide better service levels, so reducing recovery time and tips on how to go about architecting it the right way is the reason why we're here. And Rick, we have a little bit of a background on you here. You were an IT manager before you worked as a product person in a company. I kind of share the same background. I started in IT before working for a vendor. You do a lot of work around the VMware community. Maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the other activities you have going on in case some of the folks listening want to check out some of your other stuff.
Well, cool. Thanks for the opportunity. I'm a longtime blogger, going on 11 years now, a couple different websites. You'll find most of that at the Rickatron blog at rickatron.us. I do work at Veeam as a product strategy specialist, and like you said, Mario, I made the transition from the profile customer to working with Veeam, simply driven out of passion. I have such a passion for virtualization and IT in general, but in particular virtualization. So, it led well into this transition, and, I'm very active in the VMware and Hyper-V communities, and it's a wild ride. I'm glad to be part of it.
Well, I too am passionate about backup, and I think that's one thing that we have in common, having met before, is that folks, frankly, don't have great backup strategies, and there are ways to go ahead and do it. A lot of folks might think it's cost and complexity that would cause them not to really do the right thing, but generally speaking, you'd agree that there's a new way of thinking required in order to manage this virtual environment, because a lot of the same approaches and tools that you use for physical machines may not give you all the capabilities you'd want for a virtual environment.
Oh, absolutely. And backup's a good example. There's plenty of other examples. We've all learned the hard way, maybe, about trying to jam a tool optimized for one platform to another platform. And the real takeaway is that big and small companies both can benefit from using the right tool from the job. Too many times we have an accepted standard for backups, and then we fundamentally change the platform, aka going to virtualization. And is that accepted standard still the right way to do it? Okay, so that's the fundamental, issue at the center of this. And Veeam delivers a lot of features for virtual machines that can't even be touched in the physical world. So we don't support physical machines yet, but it's one of those right tool for the job types of approaches. And it's not limited to the enterprises. The small business can benefit from these approaches as well.
I think the right tool for the job applies to physical storage as well, Rick, because many folks might have a SAN, and if they're virtualizing, almost certainly they're probably looking into getting into a SAN, or they already have a SAN, because you can't take advantage of things like vMotion without having shared storage. But the right tool for the job from a backup perspective may not be putting all of your backup images on your higher cost capacity storage. You might want to look into using lower cost per capacity storage to hold those backups. And you'll talk throughout this presentation about the pros and cons of doing different things from an approach perspective. But I think an SMB probably has the same requirements as just about any large company. They want fast recovery times. They want to be able to test their backups. They want to be able to restore them certainly very quickly. And I think I will talk a little bit more about the application agents. But what do you normally get in terms of questions around application agents, especially in smaller environments where you don't have an IT person who's dedicated to backup? They're doing 15 different jobs. That can be a headache, huh?
Well, that's exactly right. It can be a headache. And then the other half of that is, especially in my own personal experience, my transition to shared storage came at the push of virtualization. So I don't think I'm unique in that. We may have lived quite happily in the direct attached storage world, okay? But once this virtualization thing came along, it's like, well, now we have to really think about shared storage. And storage can require, if not the most, definitely a lot of planning along that transition. And when it comes to backups, there's one theme, okay? And it's the same in the small business and it's the same in the big environment. It's really isolating your domains of failure, okay? So it doesn't do me much good if my virtual machines live on a high-SCSI target on a LUN on SAN controller 1, and then I put my backups on LUN 2 on that same controller if I lose that controller, okay? So by delivering separate domains of failure, meaning a separate storage product, I can really mitigate that risk to enable the best recovery. And further, I'd go so far even to say consider different products, okay? Let's take, if you have your backup data stored on SAN product A, as well as your primary production virtual machine storage on SAN product A, if you update the firmware for both of them at the same time, that causes a problem. So then you've knocked out two domains of failure right there at once. So planning for storage, I like to equate it like an onion. You can just keep going deeper and deeper with the different layers, but you have to really consider that the protection theme is central to it all.
Right, and that's what we talk about here in the basic architecture, Rick. Having those different failure domains with different storage products. We at Drobo get questions all the time about SAN because folks are new to it, just like you mentioned, being new to virtualization, thus new to shared storage. Oftentimes, the price tag of one of those primary storage arrays can also be challenging, especially in today's economic environment. So isolating failure domains, some people might see as a luxury if they have enough money to buy multiple devices. But what you're saying is, in the architecture, you can tier out your storage by having on-site storage different than your primary, and then even off-site storage that doesn't have to match your primary. That way you're isolating your failure domains and also setting yourself up from protection from other types of calamities or disasters.
Absolutely. And the takeaway, though, is when we start talking about domains of failure, and especially for the small business, we don't want to associate that with complexity, okay? So, we can deliver these design principles in a way that allows us to provide the protection yet not increase our complexity. And then we're talking about product A, product B, and the arrows flying all over. It doesn't necessarily have to be complex. So, we want to take solutions that work easily, out of the box, ready to go, easy to set up. I might not be a SAN admin, right? Now, personally, in my own experience, I do have a lot of experience with storage. But with those economic drivers and the business requirements, and most importantly, the time that we have to do stuff, we might not have the bandwidth within our reach and our practice to really deliver the right approach to doing things. So that's why I think simplicity, easy to use, ways of reaching this goal of multiple domains of failure can really help us out.
Well, I've long said it on my podcast here that time really is the biggest scarcity factor in a small business. When you're fixing copiers and doing security cameras and your firewall settings and all the applications there on the IT back office applications, there's not enough time during the day. So I agree with you that you need to have things simplified, and we'll talk about ways to make it as simple as possible. Before we move off this slide, Rick, talk to me about the requirement for deduplication, because you talked about not having enough time bandwidth. There is sometimes a scarcity of resource around network bandwidth and certainly storage. People want to minimize that. These purple arrows that we show here show a reduction in the amount of traffic, and that's powered by deduplication. Give us a definition of deduplication from a backup perspective.
Sure. Well, first of all, the backup perspective is the way that Veeam approaches it. But, deduplication can exist in a number of different ways, right? You can have storage-driven dedupe. You can have a software-driven dedupe that compresses volumes effectively and stuff like that. But in terms of backup, Veeam's doing something that's a little bit different. So, if you're familiar with all these other ways of doing dedupe, you might need to change your thought a little bit. So Veeam is, if you may or may not know, backs up VMware and soon-to-be Hyper-V virtual machines. And one of the features that we've been delivering with Veeam Backup and Replication is host-based deduplication, or actually more specifically source-based deduplication. So let's kind of look inside the virtual machine for a second. When we go to back it up, we map out regions of the virtual disk, okay, like a VMDK and soon to be a VHD file. We map those out into regions of 256K, 512K, or 1 megabyte, okay? And then we determine, through checksums, like any other dedupe, we determine if those regions already exist in our backup repository. If it does, we'll skip it and replace that region with a pointer, and then we'll process on to the next region. Actually, we do a lot of those simultaneously, technically, but in a nutshell, that's how it works. Now, how is that good and how is that different? Well, it's, might easily be foreseen as different, but how it's good, let's think about that. If we don't have to transfer and then churn and burn through all the blocks to find the dedupes, it's actually quite efficient, especially for a software product like Veeam Backup and Replication, because, we're not the disk subsystem. We don't own the drives, right? We only consume and write therein. So by us applying the deduplication at the source, it's really the most efficient way for backups to happen. And, I did mention the block sizes that we use, but it's really quite a nice backup deduplication solution. I have an academic example that can give some ridiculous amounts of dedupe, taking a number of virtual machines that are very similar. But then back to the practice points of how do we go virtual, we want to make sure all of our practice points are good. So using templates, consistent configuration, good block size arrangements on the virtual disk, all that good stuff, and block alignment, for example, all that good stuff will really help our dedupe. And really, for the price, it's a great solution.
And it doesn't have to be built into the storage. You talk about that benefit applying to all VMs, no matter what storage it's going on. In terms of requirements for the SMB VM backup, we've talked a little about kind of what to look for, but to drill down a little bit more, you want to have the ability to recover virtualized application items without any added complexities. This is, I think, one of the things that folks want from a service level perspective, because when someone asks for something restored, they want it done really, really quickly. Talk about some of the accessibility benefits of being able to restore at the item level versus having to restore an entire machine.
Well, that's really the value prop, right? Because your restore capabilities are critical. And I guess another way of saying that is your backup is only as good as how much of it you can restore, okay? So when it comes to restoring stuff, it can be tough, right? You might not want to do a wholesale restore of the VM. You might not want to do a wholesale restore of a SQL database, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about a technology that Veeam has called VMware in a bit, but simply put, to have a virtual environment, if you didn't have any solutions in place, any backup solutions, you could use your guest agents, you could use your OS tools, all these different things. But I don't like agents myself. I don't like managing them, right? So Veeam's approach is to do everything agentlessly. So then you start to say, well, how can I get application consistency, right? Because if I want to talk about a SQL database table, or I want to look at a SQL stored procedure, I can't ensure that database is in good shape if I'm not backing it up correctly. Well, that's where Veeam has kind of excelled in delivering agentless backups, because we've delivered, for example, one technology, volume shadow copy service integration. So we have a VSS extension for backing up Windows virtual machines and applications that support VSS in an application-consistent manner. That's really important to the SQL servers, the Exchange servers, the Active Directory domain controllers, all those different technologies that we all really care about, right? We need to be able to do that consistently, but then most importantly on the recovery, we can really pull out anything out of these objects. And we have a virtual lab capability on the Veeam side that allows virtual machines to be booted up in a private environment. So that's real important, right? We don't want to have a virtual machine start interfering with production. But the real magic here is that we don't have to do a wholesale restore. With a technology called vPower, which is really central to all the rich features with Veeam Backup and Replication, we can actually look inside of the virtual machine backup file, find those VMs that we've backed up at all their different recovery points, inventory them within the vSphere environment, and then run them. So from a network, a compute, and a memory standpoint, they're running on the production VMware network. It may or may not be in an isolated lab, depending on how the job is run, but the storage is running directly from the backup file. So there's a lot of flexibility that comes with that, and that's where our item recovery is driven.
And this doesn't have to be complex. I know you talked about a lot of sophisticated capabilities there, but generally speaking, small and medium business people are going to look for things in a package that's easy to use because they don't want to become an expert at multiple tools. That's a question I might have for you. How does someone then distinguish from a requirements perspective whether to use tools that might exist in their virtual server environment, built-in tools they may have paid for and licensed versus a dedicated tool? Is it more complex to have more than one tool, or do you get simplicity benefits by having the tool that's more specially purposed for the use case?
Well, that's an academic question, right? Do you want to have a single tool, or do you want the best tool for the job? I could kind of go both ways on that. In terms of backup, I can kind of answer that the same way, because in terms of some of these specialized recovery options, right, what's the easiest way to do that kind of stuff? Well, it's a wizard, okay? So in some of the solutions we have that, Instant VM Recovery we'll talk about in a bit, and then item recovery, that's all wizard-driven. It can't get much easier than that. What do you want to restore? Where from? Where to? Go. And then you're really delivering some pretty rich functionality by a couple clicks of a wizard, and it doesn't take that long to do either. I mean, there's some things we have to get our head around, especially this concept of the isolated network that I mentioned earlier.
Right.
We have resources on our Veeam forums, and people blog about it, all that good stuff. But the short answer is one tool for backup that can really deliver the most features is probably a good way to go.
And having tested it myself, we're using it internally in our own environment. And Drobo is a small company. We have about 100 employees, so we fit the mold of a small and medium business. And we like the solution because it fits a lot with the Drobo philosophy around things being as automated and easy to use, really having things do what they do automatically. When you do need to interact, have it be wizard-driven and ultra-simplified, but generally take the complexity and the decisions out of the equation and make it very straightforward. So those are some requirements that folks are going to want to keep in mind as they're looking at that. There are some concerns, certainly protecting and expanding data sets, the complexity, of recovery and reliability. You talked a little bit about some of the best practices there in those things. And we're going to go through a couple slides here that address some of those concerns with a specialized VM backup strategy, because we want to have deduplication to make the storage efficient, as well as if you do have off-site backup for those images to be much more efficient going across the wire. Instant VM recovery, selective recovery, and then verification are all things that are built into the solution. So let's step through those one at a time, Rick. Talking about instant VM recovery, we alluded to it earlier, but if I understand this correctly, what it means is you will launch the VM straight off of where it's backed up without having to do any restore, so it really is instant. That's where the name comes from, right?
That's exactly right. And the screenshot here, I'm not sure if the folks listening on the line can see it, but that's 23 seconds. Okay, so what's happening there is there were a couple of steps in this wizard. This is wizard-driven. You can see on the left, the virtual machine was identified, basically saying what virtual machine do you want, what recovery point do you want, where do you want to put it, where are you going to manage the updates. That's important because we always keep the backup files read-only. And then why are we doing this? And then summarize it and ready to go. So in those few clicks, we can restore a failed VM that quickly. And I like to equate that to like a flat tire. If you're driving down the road in your car, what's the quickest way to get back on the road? It's a spare tire that might be sitting in your trunk. Okay, but a couple of caveats with that. You can't go as fast and you can't go as far, but it'll definitely get you back up and running as soon as possible. That's really kind of how instant VM recovery works. And then from there, with VMware, we can migrate it, or if we don't have storage vMotion, okay, to put it back on a production data store, we can use replication of Veeam backup and replication, or we can schedule some downtime and move it back when the time is right. But the takeaway, Mario, is that you can do a lot more with the VM when it's running than when it's not running. And instant VM recovery is probably the number one feature that people like. I love, if anybody's going to be at SMW, stop by and see me, or VMworld will have some demos over in Europe. But the demo I like to give is I have 150 gigabyte SQL VM, right? We all deal with some of those big monster VMs. Well, that's not quite monster, but it has that much disk space. I can recover that VM in about a minute and a half. It's a great demo.
Fantastic. I know by having all of your backups online and ready to be recovered, having instant VM recovery is great because you have all those different points to select from. The power of shared storage really comes to bear there because you can bring it back up and get your services up and running a lot quicker, or at least test the stuff. The fact that you can do this makes testing it a breeze, which I think is a really big benefit for customers. The next point we wanted to talk about was around the specific technology developed by Veeam that allows you to recover your application-specific type of information without agents and without any special backups. I think this is kind of important because you're talking about an approach, Rick, that just means backing it up one way and having the power to either restore it fully or restore it selectively. There's no need to make multiple backups depending on how you want to restore it.
Absolutely. And just how Instant VM Recovery kind of enumerates that virtual machine's recovery point in the backup repository, which is just a big file that contains the Veeam backups, UWare takes that one step further. Well, Instant VM Recovery will throw it back up on the network ready to go, but UWare will fire it up in a lab or a special isolated environment. And that's, alluding to the network stuff that I talked about earlier. But basically, this is where we can have some wizard-driven interaction as well. So again, back to SQL Server, one of the demos I like to do is restore just a SQL table. Okay, and again, this is from the SQL Server that wasn't backed up with an in-guest agent. We do have VSS and log truncation, all that good stuff that goes along with application-consistent backups, but we can recover very granularly. Or we can even use our native tools, and this is a good example. I don't know what I changed in the SQL stored procedure. Well, do I need to restore the whole database? That might be a little bit much. What I can do with UWare, and more specifically the virtual lab capability, is I can power that SQL Server up in a lab, and then I can connect to it with SQL Server Management Studio, and then connect to my production database with SQL Server Management Studio, look at them left window, right window, left window, right window. What's changed in my stored procedure? It's going to be pretty easy to determine that way. If my SQL Server needs Active Directory authentication, no problem. Throw a domain controller in your backup and restore it with it. It's pretty easy. And we do have wizard-driven options as well to kind of mitigate the complexity. And the wizard, it's really for the popular things, right? SQL, Exchange, Active Directory really helps make it a straightforward solution, in my opinion.
And you don't need a dedicated test lab here necessarily from a storage perspective because your backup appliance, in this case the Drobo, ends up being the place from which you can launch these things. So it doesn't even have to be related to your primary production. You can maintain your failure domains and have this type of sandbox capability without having to buy a whole other SAN. So the storage you buy for your backup can serve that way. I think that's one of the powerful things that is supported by Veeam. Last thing I want to talk about, though, Rick, was Sure Backup, because I don't know how many times folks have called me up to say, I've been backing up religiously, I've been doing my regimen, it's all there, but at the end of the day, I threw the tape in there and I just couldn't get the data back off of it. This is something that folks really lose sleep at night over, but there are capabilities built into Veeam which help you rest a little bit better.
Absolutely. And we're, again, using that virtual machine backup file, that repository. And in all these situations, technically in vSphere talk, what we're doing is we're providing a proprietary NFS driver. So we have this new data store that shows up that's called Veeam Backup. And in that Veeam Backup, we have all of our VMs that we've enumerated. And with Sure Backup, what we do is we find the virtual machines that we've just backed up, and we automate the recoverability of it. Okay, so let me clarify what I mean by recoverability. That's way different than what we would call a verification. Basically, what that means is we're going to find that virtual machine in the backup file. We're going to power it on. We're going to make sure that the networking comes up as we expect. We're going to make sure that the virtual machine heartbeat comes in as we would expect. And we'll also make sure that applications run as we would expect. Now, we can even put a little bit more automation in there. And let's say that I have a complicated application. This application on this VM, this is my company's paycheck, okay? If I have something like that, and if I can script a check, meaning everything from SQL check DB to interact with a web service call, whatever, if I can run a script, I can put this in a Sure Backup job to automate that this virtual machine is backed up correctly and it can be recovered correctly. I love hearing some of the stories. One unfortunate was that there was one virtual machine that I heard of from a situation that there was a hive of the registry in this. Oddly enough, this virtual machine stayed online. It wasn't a problem until it rebooted. Unfortunately, this virtual machine had a very high uptime because it was the company's paycheck effectively. And when it rebooted, then we saw the problem. Unfortunately, though, the backup wasn't verified, that the restore wasn't ever tested, and the retention policy had been exhausted. So go back a week, go back a month, go back 2 months. Every single one of them had that problem because the virtual machine had been online for 8 months or so. They kept a really robust 3-month window, but you can see where the problem can arise if restores aren't tested, and the only way to really ensure that is to automate it. We all don't have the time to test restores, okay? So we can add a step with Sure Backup that'll automate that. And what's important is that this will not incur any changes to the backup file. It's all done in a read-only fashion. Secondly, it doesn't put duress on primary storage. This all happens on the backup target. So you can get some automated reports. It will send you emails if it's all good. It's a great solution.
I wanted to make a point, Rick, about the idea of checking things in the background. It's something that a Drobo does automatically. As data is stored, we'll be doing health and hygiene in the background. So people will say, heck, why is my Drobo running in the middle of the night when there's no applications using it? Well, it's off doing data scrubbing to make sure if there are any bad blocks, we immediately move the data off that area of the storage so you can avoid soft sector errors and make sure that stuff that's rarely accessed might not come up as accessible when you go to access it. And that's one of the things from a storage perspective that can give you a little bit more assurance that you've got your backups that are being very recoverable, both from a software perspective and a hardware perspective. Here, if I talk about putting it all together, Rick, the reference architecture that I like to use when Drobo customers are asking about the best way to do VM backup would be to use VM backup and replication version 5. You've made announcements about version 6, which will be shipping in the future, but all the features we talked about today are built into version 5, correct?
That's correct. Version 5 for VMware virtual machines has everything we've talked about today. Hyper-V support, which will be out later this year, will not have vPower, but we will have 2-in-1 backup and replication. We will have host or the source-based deduplication, and it will be available for free Hyper-V as well as SCVMM type of failover cluster environments as well.
Now, we recommend at Drobo putting a dedicated server together, Windows Server 2008 R2. You can have it run as a virtual machine. Maybe you can just give us some quick sizing thoughts, Rick, around when to run Veeam as a VM or when to run Veeam as a server.
Sure. There's a lot of considerations that go along with that. And I have a blog post at the Veeam blog. Should it be a physical server? If you get specific questions, I got a couple more thoughts there, but you're really given a lot of flexibility with the Drobo backup target. First of all, Beyond RAID will help you expand your backup repository. I mean, we do have our deduplication, but we all know that backups grow, right? So if you need to add more space to that environment, that's not going to be a problem with Drobo as a target. So in this screenshot here, we do have, like it says, it can be a physical or a virtual machine. As a rule of thumb, you're better off with a physical machine if you're fiber channel. Okay, so if your source virtual machines are fiber, then you probably want to be physical, and that's really to use VMware's direct SAN mode. Okay, so that communicates directly to the LUN rather than moving all of the data through an ESX server or through vCenter. It's just the most efficient way is to go right to the source, right to the LUN, and we can best do that as a physical machine. Now, for a virtual machine, we can still access fiber channel resources through something we call Virtual Appliance Hot Add, which is a feature where a VMDK can have 2 VMs accessing it, and that's really only for backups. And then lastly, there's a mode called Network Mode, which would move it over to ESX IO stack, which of course is the least desirable option. In terms of your backup target, the best way to do it is to have an iSCSI target on Drobo Pro and higher, and then provision that directly to the IQN of the Veeam server, so that iSCSI initiator on the Veeam backup and replication server would latch onto that LUN and put his backups there as a local drive, so E drive, F drive. And now, if you did have, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Mario, it'd be like the FS series and have CIFS built into them.
Yeah.
You can also write directly to a UNC path. So whatever works for you or a mapped drive, you can go either way. probably the best option would be iSCSI, for that local on-site quick backup. You'd probably be best suited there. It would be my suspicion. And then, a couple of different approaches to how you organize your backups, right? You want to make sure you have like virtual machines in a job. That'll increase the deduplication. When Hyper-V support comes out, I did mention we'll have replication, deduplication, and change block tracking. Those are all important things that'll help us kind of organize in the same way. So all kinds of stuff go into the design, but basically you want to, again, separate the domains of failure, which we've got here. You want to organize your jobs by like OSs, like source templates, things like that. One important consideration is, should the Veeam server live on the cluster? What if the problem's with the whole cluster? Do we need to put it outside? Maybe if we have one dev VMware environment that's not part of the cluster, let's go ahead and put it over there. And that'll help us in a couple ways. One is we'll avoid CPU duress of the backups within the cluster. And secondly, if the cluster fails entirely, our backup infrastructure is separate. So how many layers of protection do we want? We can, you can go far and deep in that category. But, from a simple 3-host arrangement here, this is a pretty straightforward architecture.
Yes, and this entire architecture is detailed in a nicely put together how-to guide with a couple dozen pages that takes you through the steps of putting a solution like this together and leveraging all the capabilities of Veeam, specifically with Drobo as the backup target. My only sizing recommendations would be that we'd have you use our B800i, the 8-bay iSCSI SAN storage for business, if you're looking for the best price capacity for backup. This is a product that has a really attractive price point with a single power supply and a fixed controller. So you're using that as your backup. For a lot of small businesses particularly, that's going to be a great architecture for them. For folks who want higher levels of hardware availability in the product, the B1200i not only has more slots for drives, but it also has redundant power supplies, swappable fan, and a hardware architecture that lends itself well to being not just a source for your backups, but you might even run some of your tier 2 primary VMs off that as an iSCSI SAN. So there's a lot of different ways to go about doing it, and we detail some of those choices in our detailed how-to guide. So I want to go ahead and now just do a real quick recap and thank you again, Rick, for joining us. Backup really is challenging, and especially around VMs, it doesn't have to be complicated or costly, but it probably requires you to think a little bit differently about how you're going to do your backup, because the same way you do your physical backup may not be ideal for virtualization. And the technologies exist today to offer really reliable recovery as well as that instant recovery we talked about, and we think that Veeam and Drobo together make a great solution, particularly for SMB, virtual machine backup, given all the characteristics of the combined solution and its fit for the complexity and cost needs for a small business. One of the questions I have for you is, how frequently should I be taking backups? It's one of those things, Rick, that do you do them constantly? Do you do them on a certain interval? How do you think about when and how often to do backup?
Well, my answer to that usually, Mario, is to identify the recovery requirements first. So what's the standard, right? Weekly, got full backup, and nightly, incremental. Well, we can do that. We can do that smart with our technologies. But we can also do what we call smart CDP, which can really bring that recovery point really, really tight. So there's a couple of technologies that are letting us do that. One is VMware's change block tracking. And then on the Hyper-V side, Veeam's actually implemented their own change block tracking, which is almost feature on par with the VMware side, so that we can really take those incremental backups incredibly quickly. I think we throw out a number of 5 minutes, so that might be a little bit much for some people. But depending on the workload and what are the recovery requirements, we can get it as tight as we can. Hourly wouldn't be unheard of, every 4 hours. I guess I'm going to say it's like a menu, right? And we can pick where we want to go.
Well, with the cost of storage being more affordable if you go for something like a Drobo as a tier 2 or a dedicated backup type of appliance, you don't have to worry about capacity being your limiting factor, because you can get a lot of capacity for all of those extra backups without having to make that trade-off. And deduplication plays a big role there too, because you're storing them very efficiently, so you're not needing to worry about, like you had with physical tape in years past, of worrying about the cost of that stuff and doing more and more backups. With a virtualized model and a shared disk-based storage model, you're given a lot more freedom to do that a lot more often. I agree with you, Rick. Why not do it more often if you can improve your recoverability, because you don't necessarily have the same constraints that you used to when thinking about backup traditionally. So another question I have for you is about offsite. I think a lot of folks, they've been given the requirement to do offsite backup, and people normally associate offsite backup with tape. So in this case, do you find a lot of Veeam customers doing offsite backups directly to disk storage that's offsite? How do you normally consult around the offsite backup requirement?
Sure. Well, let's also clarify, the product name is Veeam Backup and Replication, and a lot of people assume that replication means you move my backups. Well, Veeam doesn't directly move the backups. The replication capability of Veeam is replicated inventory virtual machine on another ESX, ESXi host locally or remote, and soon to be Microsoft Hyper-V. Now, when it comes to the backup files, the data, it's actually, I hate to say it, is what a lot of people are doing is using rsync. In our Veeam forums, there's an incredible amount of content of people using rsync with, some of the block changes aware that can very efficiently move data off-site. We do have and then you, of course, could seed it. You do the big copy initially on local bandwidth and then move it. But disk to disk to off-site disk, it's not an impossible challenge, even on the simple side.
Great. Well, I appreciate that consultation, and very much appreciate you taking time with us today to talk to the Drobo Broadcast Network audience about the best ways to approach virtual machine backup from a small and medium business perspective. For all the folks out there, we definitely thank you for your participation as well. And there is additional information at this URL, drobo.com/Veeam. You'll find that detailed how-to guide that I mentioned. We also have a solution brief on the joint solution that you can find there, as well as access to some other demonstration resources. But I wanted to point out that there's also a 30-day risk-free trial opportunity. So you can go there and click on that, provide your information, and get access to Veeam software on a 30-day trial basis, as well as sign up to be contacted regarding a Drobo evaluation. Because for a lot of folks, once they get this and they can see how it works and they can experience it for themselves, they really do see how it can be of benefit to them. So we want folks to take advantage of that offer if they have an interest, or just get a little bit more information at that URL, drobo.com/Veeam. So on behalf of Drobo, I want to thank you again, Rick, very much for participating in today's podcast. And you yourself, you have your own podcast series if folks want to check you out there at veeam.com/podcast or hit you up on Twitter. Any parting comments then for us, Rick?
No, thanks everyone for attending, and thank you, Mario, for having me. It's been a great time.
All right. Tune in next time, folks, where we'll talk about other topics of interest for SMB IT. I'm Mario Blandini at Drobo, and this has been another edition of the Drobo Broadcast Network. Thanks again.